Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. And thank you for your patience. We just had a few minutes to get the live stream set up. We're actually streaming this live to LinkedIn right now and recording as you saw when you joined. We'll just give another minute or two to let folks trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right, let's get started. Well, first off, welcome, and thank you everyone for joining. Really excited to be here today, and really excited for the folks that you're able to join us. This is the first of several webinars and events over the next few months where we'll look to introduce the Tom Ford Plastic Innovation Prize to potential entrants, partners, and just provide more information to the community about the competition and its progress. So thanks again for joining. Before we get into the sort of agenda for the day, I did want to sort of just level set on our intended outcomes, for the session here today. And we really want three key things here. First off, we want people to, obviously leave here feeling informed about the Tom Ford Plastic Innovation Prize. Secondly, to feel excited about the potential of the prize to really make an impact on the thin film plastic pollution problem. And lastly, to be, again, empowered to participate in some way, whether that's to submit an innovation to the competition, to share about the competition with their network, or to join us as a partner. So just wanted to set that intention here at the outset, and we're excited to talk you through it. So just our agenda for the day, we'll start off talking a little bit about the logistics for the webinar. We'll do a few introductions. Then we'll get into sort of the heart about an overview of the prize and the opportunity it presents. We'll talk just briefly about some additional considerations for entrants as we think about it, and then we'll get to our question and answer segment. And then we'll talk about some next steps. The session is designed to be sort of broadly informative, but with a little bit of a focus towards prospective applicants. But we do know and hope and say hi to potential partners or existing partners who have been able to join us. We'll share some contact information at the end of the session, which is also on our website. One note is that the competition guidelines, which again are also on our website, covers a lot of this content. So please, consult those for additional information, and we'll also have some other resources available. If time's available, at the end of the session, we'll include a run-through of the submission portal for prospective applicants. If we don't have time, we will record a separate tutorial for that and then share that out. So just a few notes on the logistics for the session here. So the audio is muted for everyone except the presenters. So please direct any questions to the Q&A feature in the Zoom interface, and we'll then sort of review those questions at the end of the session, and we'll answer as many as possible. You can put those questions into the Q&A at any time, and there's some that we may be able to direct you to links and stuff like that during the Q&A, so you can get those questions answered before we get to that session. We'll share out a recording of the webinar after this in the next week or two. We do have a second webinar scheduled for Tuesday, July 13th, and that's at 8 a.m. GMT, and that's going to cover the same content as the session today, but it's just designed for folks who are in Eastern Europe and Asia. So there's no need to attend both, but if you do have folks that couldn't join today who, because of the time difference, or who potentially might be interested, who are based in those time zones, feel free to share that, and you can keep an eye on our channels there. If you have additional questions, issues, things you want to raise to us, the email address is there. It's info@plasticprize.org. On the website, we'll add some of these questions that come up in our frequently asked questions section, and we'll also include some in our prize newsletter. So please sign up there, and you can do that on our website. Just a quick note on some of the folks you'll be hearing from today. Just to introduce myself, my name is Tim Selman. I'm the director of the Plastic Innovation Prize. Joining me today is Dr. Dune Ives, who's the CEO of Lonely Whale, and you'll hear from her in just a second. We'll be your presenters today, and then we have a few other folks joining us today, particularly for the Q&A session at the end. First is Dr. Ramani Narayan, who's the University Distinguished Professor at Michigan State University in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Material Science. He's an expert on biologically degradable and bio-based materials, and he serves on the Prize Scientific and Technical Advisory Board. The second is Dr. Evan White, who's the director of the Biocyanotic Laboratory at the University of Georgia New Materials Institute. Dr. White and his colleagues are going to be leading the laboratory and field testing during the final testing round of the Tom Ford Plastic Innovation Prize, and you'll hear more about that final testing round towards the end of or later in the presentation. And lastly, my colleague, Kendall Starkman, who directs our Next Wave Plastic Initiative, which is a consortium convened by Lonely Whale that focuses on ocean-bound plastic and integrating those into supply chains. So they're here with us as well for the Q&A to answer some technical questions. But with that, I want to turn it over to Dune to talk a little bit about sort of the origins of the prize and a little bit about Lonely Whale, and then we'll get into the heart of talking about the competition.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like today's webinar has been at least 2 years in the making. And so I have the great privilege of telling you a little bit about how we got to this point and some of the data that really drove our decision to launch a prize, and then who we launched that prize with. So Lonely Whale, for those of you who don't know us, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in just a few slides, but we're extremely data-driven. And anytime we think about launching a new campaign, it's because we've identified a gap in the supply chain. We've identified an opportunity to leverage market actors or policymakers to be able to move forward much more quickly with great expediency, intention, and towards permanency to be able to address gaps that we see in the supply chain that allow us then to create campaigns that get consumers, get business leaders, get policymakers really excited about the change that could come. When we started our research in 2019 around thin film, it was really with the intention of understanding the space better. Thin film, for everybody on the call, I'm sure really understands that thin film is a term that's used, it's applied to many different kinds of applications, whether that be shrink wrap or grocery bags, or in our case, poly bags that we're really looking at, even Ziploc and other type of resealable sandwich and storage baggies. So this big broad category of thin film is actually quite a challenge as well in the environment. So we know from our research that just 2 types of thin film plastic items, poly bags and resealable and reusable storage and sandwich baggies, represent about 300 billion bags used every single year. Very, very, very few, if any of those, are truly recycled. So let alone getting into a recycling facility, but then also being able to be upcycled or even downcycled. We know that thin film as a category represents approximately 46% of the plastic that leaks into the ocean. And we all know the stats on this call. I think everyone's really familiar with the Pew Charitable Trust and Systemic report that came out and said by the year 2040, we're expecting to see the amount of plastic entering the ocean to nearly triple to 29 million metric tons. For us, that's really unacceptable, but this is also a really exciting opportunity. Can you go on to the next slide, Tim? And what we found as we did this research is we went all the way back to the origins of plastic. And there are a couple of different origin stories for where plastic came from. The one we really like is, and the one that really kind of catapulted us towards creating an innovation prize, is the story of plastic that started with an innovation around elephants. So many people probably don't realize that in the late 1800s, elephant populations were being decimated for one primary purpose, and that was to create billiard balls. So there was a gentleman who created an innovation prize looking for an alternative material to stop the decimation of elephants for their ivory tusks and to replace that with something that maybe didn't have as much of an environmental impact. Well, out of this prize came the early starts of plastic. So we thought, boy, an innovation prize around this particular item that is so large, maybe as large as an elephant or a herd of elephants. Let's see if we can maybe apply this concept of innovation prize to thin film plastics. Let's go into the next slide. But every good prize needs a really good leader. And what we wanted to make sure that we were able to do right from the very beginning was to bring industry to the table with the prize. So for us, it wasn't enough for Lonely Well, a nonprofit, to start a prize and to see what kind of innovation came from it. We really wanted to make sure that we had leaders within industry standing next to us saying we're not only intrigued by what comes out of the prize, but we are willing to be voices, leadership voices, to make sure that others within the industry are really tackling this issue with you. So Tom Ford's team and we connected on an area of mutual interest. They were getting ready to launch the first luxury watch made from ocean-bound plastics. Of course, with our Next Wave Plastics initiative, that is something that is also of interest to us, stopping the flow of plastic before it gets into the ocean. Tom Ford being perhaps the most recognizable and most influential American designer and global designer with such a great reputation, he himself is very passionate around eliminating single-use plastic, not only from his personal life, but also from across the business and the industry. And of that 300 billion single-use bags that are used every year, not recycled, we can assume safely, not recycled, 180 billion of those come from the fashion industry. So for us, partnering with Tom Ford and his team really made a tremendous amount of sense so that we could take the winners from this prize and see application within the industry almost immediately. Let's go on to the next slide. So I'm going to give you just a real quick overview of Lonely Well and talk with you just briefly about one campaign that we did 2 years ago that really kind of set the foundation for us in this particular work. So Lonely Well is a nonprofit organization. We run multiple campaigns. Many of you probably know us from our ubiquitous Stop Sucking campaign. That was very exciting. Also very focused on supply chain, even though out front we had a very consumer-facing campaign that got people excited to tell each other to stop sucking. Who doesn't want to do that at some point in their lives? And then we also ran our Hydrate campaign I'm going to talk with you about in just a second. Next Wave Plastics fits under the umbrella of Lonely Well, as does our youth-oriented Ocean Heroes network. We also have launched into this concept we call 52 Hertz, which is a for-profit creative consultancy. And in partnership with 52 Hertz, which is wholly owned by the nonprofit organization, we launched together the Tom Ford Plastic Innovation Prize. So what we're able to do with Lonely Well and 52 Hertz is really bring forward creative genius and production talent and engagement with industry, and then also just the firepower of the nonprofit organization sitting behind it to bring NGOs and scientists, some of whom are on the call today, to bear on this particular issue. So just really quickly, so you can see the kind of work we've done in the past, is our Question How You Hydrate campaign. We launched this campaign, actually, let's go ahead and go forward to the next one. We launched this campaign in 2019. It came after our straw campaign when someone asked us, can you do for the plastic water bottle what you did for the plastic straw? Now, what was interesting about the plastic straw campaign is that we had at least one alternative straw manufacturer in the market who could scale with our campaign, or so we thought. We actually had to slow the campaign down just a bit to allow the manufacturer to catch up to us. So we learned a lot through that campaign. And in Question How You Hydrate, we wanted to tackle the issue of single-use plastic bottles that package water. which was a growing part of the industry. In 2017, nearly 26% of all new PET polymers were produced by the petrochem industry for the express purpose of the growth of the single-use plastic bottled water market. So here we saw a great opportunity to match our campaign prowess with a growing industry and bring forward alternative products in the marketplace that could really scale. We partnered with the brand AMI Beverage Company to help ensure that they could bring a product to market, which they did in less than 4 months. So from start to finish, they worked on a new product called Ever and Ever, which is water bottled in a screw top aluminum can as an alternative. And together we launched this campaign, and almost immediately we saw some major shifts from big brands like Coca-Cola and Pepsi that moved away from single-use plastic water bottles into aluminum cans, which is infinitely recyclable and better for the planet when you use 100% recycled aluminum, or as close to it as you can get. So this is the backdrop for this particular campaign. But with this prize, what we're doing is starting first with the innovation, because we know the gap is gigantic. We know that there are not products out in the marketplace yet that can scale, but we know that many of you on this call have products that, with this innovation prize and with capital investors looking to help grow in this space, and with industry ready, willing, and able to buy this material, that we can together make a difference in the 180 billion poly bags, and hopefully also the 125 billion sandwich and storage baggies just in the United States every year. So with that, I will turn it back over to my colleague, Tim. Thank you all for joining us. I'm so excited about what comes out of this prize, and I cannot wait to hear more from you.
Thanks, Dune. Yeah, I mean, I hope people from that got a really good sense of who we are at Lonely Whale and sort of the genesis and sort of the, I would say, having worked on a number of prize competitions in the past, like the unique value proposition that this prize represents based on sort of the involvement of an organization like Lonely Whale, and sort of based on our sort of experience running these campaigns and driving systems change. Just so now we're going to turn and talk a little bit more about the prize in detail. First, I would note that the Tom Ford Plastic Innovation Prize is a 2-year competition followed by 3 years of support for competition finalists, and it's designed to incentivize the development and scale and innovation at scale of alternatives to thin film plastic. And when we talk about alternatives to thin film plastic, and you'll note here, these are 3 sort of core areas of strategic focus for the prize. One is that the focus is on material innovation solutions. Now we recognize that recycling technology, reusable solutions, new business models are all really critical. But our read of the market is that a number of competitions have focused on that in the past. And we do really feel like for thin film plastic specifically, that material innovation is really where we need to be focusing our efforts, given that it's a high volume, low value product. The second from that is that when we start talking about material innovation, we are going to validate the performance of those innovations via third-party testing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the finalists of the competition are going to submit samples of their materials for lab and field testing analyses that we've been working on in conjunction with the New Materials Institute, as well as our scientific and technical advisory board. And lastly, I think really unique, also unique among the canon of innovation prizes and competitions is that, our focus is not just on innovation, but it's really on facilitating scale. We expect that the prize will catalyze new innovation, but the goal is not just new innovation, it's really the adoption at scale of these thin film plastic alternatives. Because ultimately, if the new innovation doesn't lead to any sort of measurable shift in the materials that companies are using, then it's not going to make a measurable impact on the thin film plastic crisis. Really quickly, I do want to highlight a couple things about sort of primary sort of eligibility criteria for the prize. And I think implicit in this third-party testing approach is that the technologies have to be at some level of development to be viable. So really, the entries must be beyond the idea stage, so ideally with a working prototype. because that will be tested during the final testing round starting in early 2022. Entries must be submitted in English, and contact our team if that presents an obstacle. The initial deadline for the completion of the technical submission and other sort of entry documentation is October 24th of this year. And we'll talk about more about what's involved there in a second. And lastly, the competition submission agreement has some additional sort of legal criteria around sort of eligibility, specifically around like where the entity can be located and that sort of thing. So please consult that document for additional details on that front. Just looking at the competition itself. So as I mentioned, this is a 2-year competition, and that is split into 2 rounds. So initially there is a sort of what I'm calling the technical submission round. So the entrants, you'll complete this technical submission, which involves a submission template as well as some supporting documentation, which will be submitted again by October 24th of this year, which will then be reviewed by the advisory board, and the judging panel will select the competition finalists. And we'll select up to 10 competitors as finalists, and they will share equally in a milestone prize of $200,000. Those finalists will then move into the final testing round, where the finalists will submit samples of their innovations for lab and field testing, which I sort of alluded to before, and we'll talk about in more detail in a minute. The advisory board will use, and the judging panel will use the results of these analyses together with the materials provided, other materials provided by the finalists to choose the prize winners. And those, we'll choose 3 prize winners, and we'll give the breakdown later in the session, but they'll share in a prize pool of $1 million in investment capital that's going towards the prize winners. And I mentioned that, after the sort of active competition phase is over, we'll turn into sort of the support phase for finalists and winners. And that is this post-competition accelerator. So we're working with our network of partners and the Lonely Whale and 52Hertz team to really drive the market adoption, as Dune was discussing in the context of some of our other campaigns. Very quickly, just sort of explaining the roles of some of the collaborators on the prize. We have our, I mentioned our judging panel. This is, you can see our current judging panel up on our website. You can, this is a sort of high-level review body that's really designed to help select competitors who are really best positioned for growth and can help drive adoption by engaging with consumers. And you can see some of the folks who we've engaged. Obviously, Tom Ford is one, Don Cheadle, Stella McCartney, Andrew Forrest, Jenny Washington. There's a whole host of them listed on our website. They'll work really closely with our scientific and technical advisory board, which is a panel of technical experts, which will be reviewing the solutions that are submitted to the competition from a slightly more technical perspective to ensure that they're sort of positioned for adoption and scale, and that they meet clear standards for sort of end of life and some of the other criteria. And obviously, as I mentioned at the outset, Dr. Narayan who's on the call with us, is one of our advisory board members who's serving on the advisory board. The third group is our Investment Alliance, and this is a group of impact investors who are helping to fund the prize purse, but also to potentially sort of co-invest in the competitors, and they'll be actively engaged in helping us understand the market positioning and the financial viability of some of the companies that are coming through. And lastly, our sort of broader category of amplification and scaling partners, and this is really, again, like a group of corporates and investors, other organizations that are really sort of collaborating with us and the participants to help, drive that market adoption. And potentially provide a pathway for doing that directly in the marketplace. I talked a little bit about the 2 rounds of the competition. I want to just briefly explain what those entail. So the first is the technical submission round, which I mentioned, which is designed to have sort of a low barrier to entry, but also be rigorous in sort of the content that we're looking for, and that really falls into 3 buckets, particularly in the submission template that I mentioned. One is really sort of details about the company and background information and the history to date. The second is providing an overview of the technology that the entrant is submitting, and the last is sort of explaining how that technology aligns with the judging criteria. In addition to this submission template, entrants are allowed to submit some supporting documentation as well, like white papers and that type of thing, and the competition guidelines and the submission portal have further information about that. And again, as I mentioned, if we have time, we'll walk people through the process of submitting to the online portal, but if not, we'll have a separate session going over those details. Looking then at the sort of final testing round, outlined here are the lab and field testing elements for the final round. And the samples that competitors submit will be analyzed according to these methods. Entrants, will also complete some supporting documentation as part of this final round. So just running through these quickly, the main part of the analysis involves respirometry, both in the soil and marine environment. And respirometry is a sort of a laboratory technique for measuring the rate and process of how materials break down and degrade under controlled conditions. And again, we'll use both soil and seawater media to analyze biological degradation. What is left at the end of the respirometry process, we'll go through two sets of analyses. One is germination, which is designed to measure the toxicity of the material that remains. And the second is an analysis around microplastics, where we'll be using microscopy and spectroscopy to test for the presence of microparticles and microplastics. In addition to those, we will be conducting some marine field testing to analyze biological degradation and impacts in environmental conditions where the products may end up under some mismanaged waste scenarios, and we're working with the advisory board to define exactly what the protocols are for those. And lastly, in addition to obviously the end of life component, these products, in order to be adopted by the marketplace, do obviously need to meet some specific performance criteria, so we will do some in-lab product performance testing. Additional information about this is contained in the competition guidelines, and the specific thresholds and testing protocols, for example, the temperature at which the respirometry will be conducted will be outlined in the rules and regulations for the competition, and those will be issued prior to the announcement of finalists. One important note is that the respirometry analysis will be more rigorous than industrial or home composting, regardless of the temperature decision, given that we'll be using more standard soil and marine media and the sort of more standard presence of microorganisms rather than what's under composting conditions. So that's just one important note that I would note for potential entrants. We talked a little bit about the judging criteria for the prize and wanted to list off just at a very high level the sort of 5 categories we're looking at. These are just the top line descriptions, and you can consult the competition guidelines for more detailed information. And again, the rules and regulations will provide for the lab testing a little bit more specifics about how these are defined from a technical perspective. But we talked about the end of life biological degradation. That's obviously the first one listed here. The second is around which we haven't talked about, is the environmental and social impacts of production. So that's really looking at the input feedstocks, the supply chain practices, labor practices, that type of thing. And obviously there's varying degrees to which we can actually assess that, but we'll ask the teams to describe those elements of their production. The third, as I mentioned already, product performance is really sort of meeting some basic standard performance specifications used by industry to ensure that these actually can be adopted. The fourth we've talked about a little bit is really around the scalability question, because we want to ensure that any innovation that's coming through this is positioned to really scale to meet that scope of the Thin Film Plastic Challenge. And lastly, just looking a little bit at cost, that's a very tricky measure to assess. So we'll really be leaning on teams to describe how their innovation it has sort of a pathway to being cost competitive with traditional thin film. With traditional thin film plastics. Looking at the timeline for the competition, obviously, as you guys are all here, we opened for submissions a few weeks ago. As I mentioned, that submission window ends on October 24th, so make sure that all the initial technical submissions are in by that point. The judging panel and the advisory board will conduct the review of those submissions between sort of the end of October and into January of next year, and we'll announce the finalists at the beginning of February of next year. Those finalists will then have about 6 weeks to submit their samples for the lab testing, and we'll also during that period have a team summit where a virtual team summit where we'll have the finalist teams join and meet each other, network, and provide some further information about the process of the remaining part of the competition. Then from March to December of next year is the final testing period for the lab testing. So we've reserved about 8 months to do the respirometry analysis. During that time, as you'll see here, we'll be working really closely with the teams, the finalist teams, and we'll be conducting a feature campaign about each of the teams to sort of explain their journey in the competition and how they got to where they are today, and to highlight the innovation that they're putting forward. We'll be reviewing the final submissions and the testing results from the finalists in Q1 of 2023, where we'll also make the announcement of the winners. And then we'll transition into this accelerator support phase and working to help scale those innovations through 2025. So again, this almost 3-year period. We'll be working closely with the finalists to help those companies really scale up. These again are just top line descriptions of each milestone. So the competition guidelines includes pretty detailed information about what's occurring during each one of these categories. I've talked a little bit about the accelerator. I want to just describe a little bit more about what's going to happen in there. And you can read more again in the competition guidelines, but we expect, to conduct activities in all 4 of these buckets, but, what specific activities we're working on with each individual company will really based on their specific needs. First off is really sort of this mentorship and strategic support to help companies really as they try to scale up their team, their technology, and we'll be there to provide that mentorship and support. The second is really around sort of introductions and facilitating partnerships. So we'll be working really closely with the finalists and the winners to connect with companies in our network, and we'll be working to help facilitate those relationships to help, again, provide some support for them to build relationships to help scale and grow their companies. The third is around, market engagement, which is really leveraging a lot of Lonely Whale's capabilities, specifically around, marketing and consumer insights. And that, again, is similarly with this solution storytelling, which I mentioned, this feature campaign for the finalists during the course of next year. That type of storytelling would continue into the accelerator phase of the competition. And we're currently working to define sort of what level of sort of programmatic specificity there is, but as I mentioned, I think a lot of this will be really ad hoc and customized to specific companies that emerge as finalists and winners, and a lot of that has to do with many of the companies that we expect to join the competition will probably have gone through incubators and accelerators previously. Talked a little bit about the prize purse, but wanted to give a little bit more specifics. Again, there's more info in the competition guidelines, but we're offering a total of $1.2 million in prizes for the competition. I already mentioned the milestone prize, which is $200,000 shared equally across the competition finalists. And then the grand prize purse is a total of $1 million, and that's actually structured as investment capital, with $600,000 going to the grand prize winner, $250,000 going to second place, and $150,000 going to third place. So in addition to the prize money, the prize obviously presents sort of a unique opportunity, and we've already previewed some of these elements when discussing the accelerator, so I won't list them all. But we do obviously have this dedicated accelerator phase designed to help scale these technologies. And as I mentioned, this really involves, marketing strategy and storytelling, facilitating partnerships, and potentially to help fundraise. This mentorship aspect, but then overall, the competition obviously has a huge, as you may have seen from Lonely Whale's past campaigns, this media exposure and visibility that we're hoping to bring to the thin film plastic problem. And given the the profile of folks that are on the judging panel, obviously they have very unique platforms to drive engagement with consumers, and we'll be working sort of to bring the full sort of heft of Lonely Whale and 52 Hertz to help showcase the competing technologies, working with the judging panel and connecting with major brands and stuff as part of the partnership facilitation. In addition, the advisory board and working with them to connect with potential collaborators and scientific experts, which obviously is key as folks are developing technologies that are being submitted to the competition. And lastly, speaking of the technologies, clearly the competition itself provides some validation for the marketplace that these technologies work and have been vetted as part of this process. Before we turn to the Q&A, and I see we have a couple questions already, I wanted to note a few things about some specific protections that we have, that may be considerations for potential entrants. So 3 key things that we want to mention here. One is that around intellectual property. So teams retain all rights to their intellectual property. So entering the competition does not transfer those rights to Tom Ford or 52 Hertz. So that's one important consideration. Secondly, we do have a robust process for disclosing and managing potential conflicts of interest, working with all of the advisory board members, the judges, and anybody else who's been formally engaged on the prize. And lastly, all materials remain confidential throughout the course of the competition and beyond. So we just want to make sure that as we know people are working really hard on bringing these innovations to market, and we want them to know that we sort of have that in mind, and that these are protections built into the competition. Okay, with that, I'll turn to the question and answer period. Just as a reminder, the audio is muted except for presenters, so enter any questions into this Q&A feature here in Zoom. We'll try to add some of these questions if they come up frequently or they're sort of major ones into the prize FAQ on the website. And we'll also include answers in the prize newsletter, and you can access both of those or sign up for the newsletter via the website link here that's listed, plasticprize.org. And if you have questions that you aren't able to answer or you aren't able to ask during the session or weren't answered, you can email us at the info@plasticprize.org email address. And any questions we don't get to or we can't answer during the session, we'll make sure to address on the website or via the newsletter. So with that, I'm going to turn to take a look at some of the questions here. Just going from the top here, will all participants in the competition be publicly announced, or will the finalists be announced publicly? I did not see any information regarding this on the competition website. The participants in the competition, sorry, I just saw a chat from my colleagues. I think for just the participants in the competition, we haven't decided yet how we want. Oh, sure, go ahead.
Okay, so for participants in the competition, One thing that we'd really like to do, and this is kind of the Lonely Wells side that I brought up earlier around raising awareness of issues as well as solutions, is we would really like to be able to highlight participants that complete their application. So in the submission information, we are asking for some more background information, some stills of photographs, and maybe not for everybody who submits, depending on how many submissions we receive, but we will reach out to you to see if we can identify you as a submitter and to highlight, to spotlight the work that you do. That's regardless if you become a finalist. So that would happen post-close or when an application comes in and is completed and is ready to go on for a judging review. And then in terms of the finalists, we are planning quite a media engagement for announcing the finalists as well.
Thanks, June. Yeah, and as I mentioned, the campaign that we would be looking to spotlight the finalists throughout the course of next year. But that both the announcement of the entrance, and specific media elements around that would be optional, as June mentioned, and so companies, if necessary, can remain sort of in stealth if they'd like, or not publicize their participation, at least prior to the announcement of finalists. I see that one of the top questions here is does this competition only focus on thin film plastics, or is it open for other forms of plastics like biodegradable plastic foams as well, which could be used in packaging? That's a great question, and the answer is yes. So we do envision that most of the submissions to the competition would be sort of a direct drop-in replacement for thin film, but we are open to other forms and other sort of, as I mentioned earlier, like sort of packaging redesigns that could be used in some of the use cases that we've targeted, which namely, single-use or resealable sandwich or storage bags and poly bags that primarily used in the fashion industry. Now, again, the judging criteria are designed to be holistic, so it's going to look at a lot of different factors. So there may be, an entirely new form factor for packaging, might have some obstacles potentially, depending on how it's structured, to being, scaled in the supply chains in the fashion industry, for example. But that's, counterbalanced potentially by the other criteria that we're looking at. So again, there's 5 categories, and so it might not score as high on that area, but may score higher on others. And that actually raises an important point. We don't expect high-performing submissions to score high on every single criteria. I think that there's obviously inherently a trade-off between sort of the end-of-life performance in these materials and the performance in the real world in terms of like how strong they are, how flexible they are, that type of thing. So there obviously are trade-offs at a number of different points throughout this. So I think people should not feel discouraged if they feel like their material is not like the perfect material, because I think we want to see a range of approaches, and we want to see a range of technologies that are coming through. One question here: what specific forms or types of plastics are your technical team including the definition of thin film plastics, so we can determine if we meet or beat your initial aggregate estimates and potential performance criteria during testing? I think we're not as so much concerned with the form or type of plastic and how that's defined. I think at the stage of the lab testing, we will specify the sort of requirements of the samples that are being submitted, namely sort of how thin they might be, sort of how many millimeters. But the base material is not going to be specified in advance, but that is one factor, as I mentioned, in sort of the production, looking at the production process to understand what the input feedstocks are. So and this is actually dovetails with the next question here on the list, is that materials have to be 100% bio-based, or can they also be partly fossil-based? I think obviously the preference is for bio-based materials, but that's not a prerequisite. And again, as in my previous answer, the criteria are designed to be holistic. So, you know, for example, a material that uses a traditional, you know, sort of traditional fossil-based plastic as an input feedstock will obviously not score as high on sort of the environmental impact category, but that might be a more scalable approach if, you know, say, for example, a company is using a plastic-based material with a sort of a resin or a wax additive that allows it to biodegrade. So that's, I think, where, again, we get into this sort of trade-off question. So, but to the answer, the core question is that the materials do not have to be 100% bio-based now. Next question is, I would like to understand what exactly you're aiming to solve for. Breaking the plastic wave has only identified 2 substitutes for flexible plastic packaging, paper and compostables. Should the prize not exclusively focus on compostables rather than biodegradables? Well, and as I mentioned earlier, the criteria we're using would, the submissions that are coming into the competition, because the criteria we're using are more rigorous than the standards for compostable materials, the materials that are coming into the competition will break down in compost, but they also our objective is to have them break down, and we'll sort of be focusing on materials that can break down in the natural environment as well. And that specifically is because the vast majority of people don't have access to industrial or home composting. And obviously we're working globally to scale up that access, but we already have systems where waste management is challenged in a number of jurisdictions, even in, you know, the United States where we're based. Very few consumers have access to industrial composting. So the objective of the competition and the way the criteria are structured is that we're looking for basically compostable plus, that they should also be able to break down in more conditions that are more analogous to the real world. So soils at a more normal temperature with a more normal sort of microorganism sort of profile. Is the prize a capped or uncapped safe note? You can actually access the terms of the safe in the competition submission agreement. So there is a link to the safe template, which gives you the terms of the safe in there. The next question is related. As part of the fundraising area, will Tom Ford support and advisory board teams expected to become financial shareholders within the finalist companies? Well, no for Tom Ford, but obviously with the presence of the grand prize being distributed as a safe, there becomes a shareholder component of that, but it's obviously a small component of the overall cap table of a company. And again, you can access the specific terms of the safe in the competition submission agreement. It looks like that's it for the questions we have in the Q&A. Before we jump into sort of walking people through the submission process, I can reference a couple questions that we've included in our frequently asked questions document, just so that folks know where they can turn to. So we've listed answers to a number of questions. So for example, like why we're focused specifically on alternative materials rather than reuse or new business models or policy change. So there's an answer for that there. We did anticipate this question about unintended consequences, about encouraging the use of biologically degradable materials and the impact on ocean plastic leakage. So we talked a little bit about there. We talk about the testing requirements and sort of why the grand prize is structured as investment in the winners rather than cash. And then we'll be adding some more answers up there. For example, like, can teams and team members add team members after they've officially entered? The answer is yes, and that sort of thing. So we'll be continually adding to the FAQ as we move forward, and we'll obviously add some of these the questions we received today to that list. In the last 5 minutes, for those who are interested in potentially entering the competition, I wanted to walk people through the submission portal just as they start working on their technical submissions for the initial competition entry. So just really quickly, before we do that, I guess I'll highlight some next steps here. So again, we'll share a recording of the webinar via social media, via the prize newsletter, and we'll host a second one to align with Asia and Australia, which will cover the same content as today, so no need to join both. That'll be Tuesday, July 13th. If you have further questions, you can email us at info@plasticprize.org. And again, help spread the word. If you don't already follow Lomi Whale, you can see our handles here across Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And lastly, visit the prize website, sign up for the newsletter, and you'll stay up to date on future happenings on the prize, in addition to obviously via social media. So, all right. So here is a little bit more detail about the process for applying. So you'll see here. This is a screenshot of the prize website. If you go to the top right-hand corner, there's a drop-down that says Login, and if you click that and then click on Submission, that'll take you to the submission portal. Once you're there, go down to the bottom left and click Create an Account. Obviously, if you haven't created one already, if you have, obviously just sign in. But then from there, just enter your email address and a password, and click register, and you'll enter here into the start of the submission portal. And so here you'll see the landing page here is just sort of a top line description of the timeline of the competition. And once you want to get started, click Start My Submission. Now, I encourage people to just get started and start working on it. And we'll keep reminding you if you're sort of in progress, because you can save your progress. You don't have to complete it all at once. Once you're in here, you'll start with entering some sort of general information about the primary contact, and we refer to that person as the team leader. So that will be that person will be the sort of primary point of contact for communications about the prize. So list here sort of the name of your organization, your company, name, title, email address, that type of thing. Once you've, as I mentioned, you can save an incomplete submission, but you can't advance until all the to the next screen until all required information has been entered. So you'll see here with country blank, the save and next option is not open, but when you filled in, what country you're in or all the other categories, you can again advance to the next screen. Here you'll list the members of the team, and you can leave that blank if you don't have any team members, or if you have multiple, you can list one here, and then at the bottom you'll see this add another team member function here. Then the next page explains sort of the requirements for submitting to the competition, and here you'll have linked out to the competition guidelines, which are also available on the main website, which has more detail about the judging criteria. And then here you'll see an explanation about that, all entrants need to complete the submission template that asks about information about their organization and the state of their technology. And that you can download here at this link. It's a Word doc, so it will open automatically if you click or it'll prompt you to download it automatically if you click there. So you can, download the materials, click, I understand, and then you'll be allowed to proceed. So I suggest folks just download that information and move forward. And here's where you can start entering the sort of information about the product and describe what it is. And you'll see here there's a character count of 1,500 characters. Below that, we do ask for specific information about how the product meets the judging criteria, and we go through all 5 of them in turn. So just asking you to confirm that your material meets that criteria, and then describe sort of the strengths and weaknesses against that criteria. And we'll obviously be using these answers as part of the submission evaluation process in conjunction with the submission template, which obviously asks about all of these topics, but we wanted folks to describe in their own words like how they felt their material performed against that criteria. Once folks are done with all of the answering those questions, they'll then get onto the next screen where they can access the competition submission agreement, which is just a legal document that just sort of outlines all the parameters of the competition, mainly, and sort of our obligations to you and sort of your requirements to us. And one note is that the team leader will need to download and sign this agreement, but all of the team members, once the submission is completed, will be sent a link to digitally sign the agreement. So there's only one completed competition submission agreement that's needed for that initial submission to be uploaded, and then any further agreements for team members would be completed digitally. So lastly, this last page is the document upload page. And so here, again, folks will need to upload the submission template. They'll need to, sign and upload the competition submission agreement, which is what I was mentioning. They can upload additional documentation, pitch decks, white papers, business plans, videos, that type of thing. You need to upload at least one PDF and with a maximum of 5 files. Again, so that any submission will be considered incomplete and ineligible without these required materials, namely the submission template and the competition submission agreement. So make sure that you have those in, because we cannot review any submissions that do not include both of those materials. The other stuff is optional, but those 2 are the 2 required ones. Lastly, you'll see here just a video spot, a rendering of how you add files to the submission portal. You can obviously drag them into that box. And then lastly, in this last box at the bottom is you can add a link to a video that showcases your material if you have one available online. And here's the final page that, just saying that you're about to submit your documents to the competition. You'll just have to click here that you sort of agree to the website terms of use and the privacy policy, which is on the main plasticprize.org page, just standard materials. And once you hit submit, there's a short pop-up indicating that you've been successful, and then it'll redirect you to the initial page that you saw where you'll see the sort of timeline, and that will indicate that you've successfully submitted to the competition. If you have any questions of whether your submission was successful, please just you feel free to email us and let us know. And lastly, I just want to thank everyone for joining. I know we're a couple minutes over, but pretty much right at the hour mark. Again, if folks have questions that weren't answered today, please just email us at info@plasticprize.org. But again, visit the website, sign up for the newsletter, and follow us on social media, and you'll kind of be plugged in for updates on the prize. But for those who are considering entering the competition, please feel free to reach out at the info address, and we're happy to answer questions and provide any further details and direct you to resources that can help answer your questions. So with that, I wanted to thank everyone for joining. I want to thank for Dune for giving us an overview of Lonely Whale, and for Dr. Narayan, Dr. White for joining us. We didn't get a lot of technical questions, but obviously we're happy to answer those should they come up. So yeah, just thanks everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing your submissions.